This is a artist rendition of Mount Horeb, which is the mountain where the people of Israel received the Ten Commandments that God wrote for them and received His law and entered into a covenant with God. And it would have been quite a spectacle for smoke and fire to descend on a mountain and to know that Moses was up there. And we know that they made golden calves and made all kinds of mistakes while they were there at the bottom of the mountain. But we know that when they left that mountain, that there was something special between them and God, having received a written law from Him and having entered into that covenant with Him. And if you read in the book of Deuteronomy, starting in the first chapter, you will read where Moses gives an account of what happened to Israel after they left Mount Horeb. And that's where we're going to spend some time this morning. So if the slides are going to have verses on them, but if you'd also like to follow along in your Bible, you can open up to Deuteronomy, and it'll be in chapters 1, 2, and 3. A couple notes about the book of Deuteronomy. You know, it's a book that we don't look at a lot or think about a lot, probably. But one thing you notice about it is that when Jesus was being tempted in the wilderness, that He quoted the book of Deuteronomy a lot to the devil. And so it was an important book to Him that He thought that we could gain a lot from. And then something else about Deuteronomy is that as it is a part of the history of Israel, I believe it's part of one of the most extended metaphors of all time. When you look at all the things that happened to Israel and the ways that they interacted with God, there are a lot of parallels to even just one human life and the way that one human interacts with God. Maybe some of that will become clear this morning. So I believe Deuteronomy is a great book to study because Jesus placed that importance on it, because it shows us a lot about human nature and the nature of God and the way they interact. And so let's go into Deuteronomy chapter 1. And so Moses picks up out at Mount Horeb, and he says in verses 6 through 8, "The Lord our God spoke to us at Horeb, saying, 'You have stayed long enough at this mountain. Turn and set your journey and go to the hill country of the Amorites and to all their neighbors in the Arabah.' Then he says, 'See, I have placed the land before you. Go in and possess the land which the Lord swore to give to your fathers, to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob, to them and their descendants after them.'" So the people had had this unusual and amazing experience of entering into a covenant with God at Mount Horeb, but He doesn't just want them to stay there. Some of the details of the covenant include their going out and conquering. They have other things to do. And He's placed before them this land for them to take possession of. And so one way we could say that is that establishing a covenant is only the beginning. There are battles to fight and victories to win. God didn't just want them to stay forever at Mount Horeb. He wanted them to go and take their own land. And you can look at any covenant that has spiritual significance. And establishing the covenant is only the beginning. There's so much that follows. So you could consider a marriage covenant. Having the marriage ceremony is only the beginning, and there's so much that follows that. Or you could think about baptism, which is entering into a covenant of Jesus' blood, and how entering into that covenant is only the beginning. It isn't everything that's ever going to happen. It's the beginning of a journey. It's the entering into a relationship which will play out in the future. There are battles to fight. There are victories to land. Or in the case of Israel, there is land to conquer. There are victories to win. And so as you think about that idea of establishing a covenant only being the beginning, I'll remind you of something we looked at a little last week in Romans chapter 6. And we think about this in terms of baptism. But he starts by asking, "What shall we say then? Are we to continue in sin so that grace may increase? May it never be. How shall we who died to sin still live in it? Or do you not know that all of us who have been baptized into Christ Jesus have been baptized into His death?" So he's essentially asking them, if we were to put it in the terms of Deuteronomy, are we to let our enemies conquer us? Are we to be passive and do nothing for the Lord? No, because we've entered into this covenant. In our case, as Christians, we've been baptized into Christ Jesus. That means we've been baptized into his death and his resurrection to a new life. Establishing the covenant was only the beginning. There's so much more that we must do now. We can't go on sinning so that grace can increase. We have battles to fight and victories to win. Or you look a little further in Romans 8:14 and 15, where he says, "If you are living according to the flesh, you must die. But if by the Spirit you are putting to death the deeds of the body, you will live. For all who are being led by the Spirit of God, these are the sons of God." So it is about present tense, if you are living according to the flesh, or if by the Spirit you are putting to death the deeds of the body. And all who are being led by the Spirit of God, these are sons of God. And so for Israel, it wasn't enough that they had been at Mount Horeb and that they had received a law. Now their job was to keep the law, and it was to follow God's instructions and to go out. There was more action for them to accomplish. And if we put that in place in our own lives, we can seek to be able to say what Paul said to Timothy when he said, "I have fought the good fight. I have finished the course. I have kept the faith." Not only did I one time make a commitment to God, I've kept that commitment. I've gone out and I've fought the fights that he wanted me to fight against selfishness and sin, against apathy, against whatever it might be for me. I've gone out and I've done the work that he gave me to do. It wasn't all about establishing the covenant. It was also about fulfilling it. So we go back to Deuteronomy chapter 1 and verse 19 as Moses continues to tell the story of the people of Israel. And he says, "Then we set out from Horeb and went through all the great and terrible wilderness which you saw on the way to the hill country of the Amorites, just as the Lord our God had commanded us. And we came to Kadesh Barnea." Now you would think that the big trouble for Israel would simply be the obvious difficulty of fighting with other groups of people, of having combat. But there was also this daily struggle of going through what he describes as a great and terrible wilderness. And in fact, they did complain about it all the time, so much that it almost drove him crazy. But it seems as he's giving this description that there was some reason perhaps for them to complain, that this great and terrible wilderness, all these people moving through without, they don't think they have enough food or water, maybe it's hot, they don't have what they need to be comfortable. And so if you think about all the difficulties that God asked Israel to go through, you'll notice that in addition to the obvious enemies that they had to fight, the big things that you think about of taking a city from the Amorites, there were constant and pervasive environmental challenges. That is just day to day, they were going through difficult circumstances. And that makes sense because they were pilgrims, they were sojourners, they were between homes. And a Christian endures the same thing in many ways. We are sojourners going towards heaven. We're not in our final destination. And many of the factors in our environment that we go through are difficult for us. We don't live in a world that is particularly easy for a Christian individual. And if you think that, maybe they were blowing things out of proportion, that, it's so bad to go through the wilderness, consider this verse in 2 Samuel 18:8, different historical context. But I find this kind of fascinating that in the description of this battle, it says the battle was spread over the whole countryside, and the forest devoured more people that day than the sword devoured. So apparently this landscape in 2 Samuel was so treacherous and so difficult that more people died just from how inhospitable the land was than died from the sword. And I wonder if you could say of modern day Christians that more are devoured by just the apathy or the materialism or the hypersexualism of our culture than are devoured by some huge, obvious enemy that comes and steals them away. That sometimes it's just the day-to-day things that are barraging you, that could wear you down as the wilderness was wearing down Israel. And you see some of that language in the New Testament. For instance, 1 John 5:19, "We know that we are of God, and the whole world lies in the power of the evil one. Things are not as they ought to be on this earth. There are many things that are difficult and that are wrong, as the whole world lies in the power of the evil one. And it's almost so pervasive sometimes that I think we don't recognize all of the ways that day-to-day life can detract from our spiritual health, can make it difficult for us to be what God has intended for us to be. In Ephesians 2:1-2, you read, "And you were dead in your trespasses and sins, in which you formerly walked according to the course of this world, according to the prince of the power of the air, of the spirit that is now working in the sons of disobedience." So it describes the devil, Satan, as being the prince of the power of the air, almost like he's everywhere. He's worked his way into everything. He's built this entire system that is designed to blind us and to hold us down. And that's the environmental challenge of going through life, striving not only to beat the obvious enemies, but not to be brought down by the environment. You go back to Moses' description, his recounting of their history in Deuteronomy 1, and in verse 20 and 21 he says, "I said to you, you have come to the hill country of the Amorites, which the Lord our God is about to give to us. See, the Lord your God has placed the land before you. Go up, take possession, as the Lord, the God of your fathers, has spoken to you. Do not fear or be dismayed." So the instruction from God was pretty clear. I'm with you. I'm going to help you win the battles. They needed to trust in God and to go where he asked them to, and they would be victorious. And what they suggested to Moses, you would see some of it following in Deuteronomy, if you're looking in chapter 1, is they suggest that they send some men into the land to look at it and to see what it's like. So they're going to do some risk assessment and try to analyze the situation and figure out how difficult it's going to be or how they should go about it. And it sounds like a good idea to Moses, so he sends 12 men out, and when they come back, 10 of them give a report that it's too difficult, that they're not going to be able to succeed. And the result in verses 26-28 of Deuteronomy 1, he says, "Yet you were not willing to go up, but rebelled against the command of the Lord your God. And you grumbled in your tents and said, because the Lord hates us, he has brought us out of the land of Egypt to deliver us into the hand of the Amorites, to destroy us. Where can we go up? Our brethren have made our hearts melt, saying, the people are bigger and taller than we. The cities are large and fortified to heaven. And besides, we saw the sons of the Anakim there, which have been these people who are just well known for being giants and not being able to be defeated." So the people decided to assess how difficult it would be to carry out God's instructions. And they concluded that it was too difficult, and they basically decided not to do it. And Moses says, you rebelled against the command of the Lord by doing this. That is, that inaction due to overwhelming odds is a form of rebellion. That when we wrap our human minds around God's instructions, if he says, go into all the world and preach the good news, or if he asks us to be perfect as our Father in heaven is perfect, and we just say, the odds are too overwhelming, we can't do this. We analyzed it and we just don't think it's going to do any good. And we decide not to do anything because we think it's too difficult. It's a form of rebellion. But, interestingly, God wouldn't let them go in because they said that, but he would let the children go in. He says, your little ones, who you said would become a prey, and your sons, who this day have no knowledge of good or evil, shall enter there. And I will give it to them, and they shall possess it. But as for you, turn around and set out for the wilderness by way of the Red Sea. Well, why did God let the children go in and not the adults? It's because the adults had developed the ability to assess the risks and the difficulties and to think of all the things that could go wrong and to make the decision, we can't do what God is asking. But the children hadn't matured, if you want to say that, enough to make those kinds of decisions. The children had a childlike faith, you could say. All they knew probably is that God told us we're going to our new home, and so we're ready to go. And then the adults say, no, we assessed it and it's too difficult, we can't do it. And so you see here that a childlike faith secures the victory, that those children who hadn't yet become cynical enough were allowed to go in. And maybe that's part of why Jesus said in Matthew 18:3, "Truly I say to you, unless you are converted and become like children, you will not enter the kingdom of heaven." And you look at the description of love in 1 Corinthians 13:7, that love bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. And I hope that we can have that kind of love that would believe all things and hope all things and endure all things for God, that we would trust him wherever he would lead and be willing to follow. And it's easy to think of all the things that can go wrong. For instance, if we want to spread the good news in Minnesota, but inaction, due to some kind of overwhelming odds, is considered a form of rebellion. And you look at statements of childlike faith in the Bible. God is described as him who is able to do far more abundantly than all we ask or think, according to the power that works within us. So that it isn't about what we can assess or even what we could imagine. It's about following him, just being willing to go and to do what he asks us to do. And in Romans 8:31, if God is for us, who can be against us? Or Philippians 4:13, I can do all things through him who strengthens me. Wherever he asks me to go, whatever foe he asks me to beat, I can do that with his help if I will trust and obey him. So back to Deuteronomy 1. Now he says, do not be shocked nor fear them. The Lord your God who goes before you will himself fight on your behalf, just as he did for you in Egypt before your eyes and in the wilderness, where you saw how the Lord your God carried you, just as a man carries his son, in all the way which you have walked until you came to this place. So he tried to convince them that God would fight for them, that God would carry them as a man carries his son. But they decided not to go. Now here's the really sad and ironic part. They decided not to go, and then later when God tells them not to go, they decide they can do it. So in Deuteronomy 1:41 through 43, every man of you girded on his weapons of war and regarded it as an easy thing to go up into the hill country. And the Lord said to me, say to them, do not go up nor fight, for I am not among you. Otherwise you will be defeated before your enemies. So I spoke to you, but you would not listen. Instead you rebelled against the command of the Lord and acted presumptuously and went up into the hill country. And then you returned and wept before the Lord, but the Lord did not listen to your voice nor give ear to you. So Israel didn't do a very good job of listening to God and knowing when he wanted them to go and when he did not want them to go. Knowing when and how to fight requires wisdom. Knowing what God is asking us to do as individuals or as groups, and what fights he's not asking us to fight. And you see a pattern in Deuteronomy 2. So that in verses 4 and 5, he says, you'll pass through the territory of your brothers, the sons of Esau who live in Seir, and they will be afraid of you. So be very careful. Do not provoke them, for I will not give you any of their land, even as little as a footstep. This isn't the place for you to fight. Then he says in verse 9, do not harass Moab, nor provoke them to war, for I will not give you any of their land as a possession. Then in verse 19, when you come to the sons of Ammon, do not harass them, or provoke them, for I will not give you any of the land of the sons of Ammon as a possession. So they started listening to God a little bit more as far as what fights he did not want them to fight. And then finally they come to Deuteronomy 2:24 and 25, and he says, arise, set out, and pass through the valley of Arnon. Look, I have given Sihon the Amorite, king of Heshbon, and his land into your hand. Begin to take possession and contend with him in battle. This day I will begin to put the dread and the fear of you upon the peoples everywhere under the heavens, who when they hear the report of you will tremble and be in anguish because of you. So there were several times when he told them, don't go and fight in this way, don't go and fight in this place. And this time when he tells them, they've learned their lesson, so they'll go and let the Lord fight for them as they fight as well. And you think of Ecclesiastes 3 and the famous passage that says all the things that there is a time to do, a time for everything under the sun. And he says there's a time to plant and a time to uproot what is planted, a time to kill and a time to heal, a time to tear down and a time to build up, a time to throw stones and a time to gather stones, a time to embrace and a time to shun embracing, a time to tear apart and a time to sew together, a time to be silent and a time to speak, a time to love and a time to hate, a time for war and a time for peace. There is a time to fight for the truth, to stand up for it. But there may be times when it's better to keep our mouths shut or to find another fight that God has better equipped us for personally. Here are some examples from the Bible of that kind of thing. So in 2 Samuel 16, 9 and 10, David is walking along and he's got the sons of Zeruiah with him, and this man comes out and starts cursing David. And they say, "Why should this dead dog curse my lord the king? Let me go over now and cut off his head." But the king said, "What have I to do with you, O sons of Zeruiah?" David never liked the sons of Zeruiah because they were bloodthirsty. And they were always out to kill someone. And this guy's cursing him. And to have a love for the Lord's anointed, the king, was a very important thing in Israel. And to defend him was to show honor to God by showing honor to his king. And yet they were so overzealous to fight for that truth that they would have done something wrong. In Luke 9, 54 and 55, there's an example with Jesus, with his apostles. And they say, "Lord, do you want us to command fire to come down from heaven and consume them?" He turned and rebuked them. So they were so zealous for the truth that Jesus had that they were ready to call down fire on anybody that opposed him. And this wasn't the time to fight. Jesus told them, he rebuked them. Sort of like when he told Peter to put the sword away and not to fight a physical fight on his behalf. One last thing that I want to notice from Deuteronomy. So this is spoken to Reuben, Gad, and Manasseh, 3 of the tribes of Israel. Moses says to them, "The Lord your God has given you this land to possess it," because they took land on the other side of the Jordan River, on the outside of the Jordan River, and everyone else was going to be on the inside. He says, "All you valiant men shall cross over armed before your brothers, the sons of Israel. But I know your wives and your little ones and your livestock. I know that you have much livestock, shall remain in your cities which I've given you, until the Lord gives rest to your fellow countrymen as to you, and they also possess the land which the Lord your God will give them beyond the Jordan. Then you may return every man to his possession, which I have given you." So these 3 tribes, they've already fought their battles and won, at least these major battles. Obviously, they're going to continue to have some difficulties to overcome, but they're in a period of rest. They've taken this land outside of the rest, and they're resting there. But Moses says, you need to go over and fight with your brothers. My brother's battle is my battle too. It wasn't enough for them to just have their own land and rest while their brothers were out still fighting. And we see how this played out in different books in the Bible. So in Numbers, this same situation with Reuben, Gad, and Manasseh, it says, "They came near to him, to Moses, and said, 'We will build here sheepfolds for our livestock and cities for our little ones, but we ourselves will be armed, ready to go before the sons of Israel until we have brought them to their place, while our little ones live in the fortified cities because of the inhabitants of the land. We will not return to our homes until every one of the sons of Israel has possessed his inheritance, as we will not rest until every one of our brothers has taken hold of that which God wants to give him. We will feel their fight and go and fight it with them.'" And Joshua tells us that they were good on this promise. And Joshua summoned the Reubenites and the Gadites and the half-tribe of Manasseh and said to them, "You have kept all that Moses, the servant of the Lord, commanded you, and have listened to my voice and all that I commanded you. You have not forsaken your brothers these many days, to this day, but have kept the charge of the commandment of the Lord your God. And now the Lord your God has given rest to your brothers, as he spoke to them. Therefore turn now and go to your tents, to the land of your possession, which Moses, the servant of the Lord, gave you beyond the Jordan." And as an individual, you might not feel like you are fighting a difficult battle right now. Maybe you certainly are, and you know it. But maybe some of us feel that we are at a time of more spiritual peace and rest. But we must remember our brothers' battles as well, that there are so many battles going on in the church right now. If it's with pornography, if it's with alcoholism or drugs, or if it's with depression, if it's just with apathy or some other thing. There are so many battles that so many of us are fighting. And if one of us is having a time of rest, that doesn't mean that we can't be active in fighting on behalf of our brothers and sisters. So look at these principles that we've drawn from Deuteronomy. That establishing a covenant is only the beginning. There are battles to fight and victories to win. I mean, the whole point of having a covenant with the people was to guide them in their future actions and the things that they would be going through, not only in that moment, but for hundreds of years in Israel's case. And for us, entering into a covenant with God in baptism is the beginning of a journey that we go on. And in addition to the obvious enemies, whatever it is that you say, that's the number one thing I struggle with. In addition to those obvious enemies, there are constant and pervasive environmental challenges. Living in a fallen world and living in a worldly culture could have effects on us in so many ways all at once that we need to be aware of. And remember that inaction due to overwhelming odds is a form of rebellion. It is childlike faith that secures the victory. So that if you think, well, it won't do any good for me to talk to people about Jesus because they won't listen, and then for that reason you decide not to talk to them, it's considered as rebellion if you look at the principles in Deuteronomy. Or if you think this sin is something that I'm just always going to struggle with, and so you just assume that you're never actually going to beat it, then that's considered a form of rebellion. You must press on and submit to God and trust Him. Even if the battle lasts a long time, or if we don't see ourselves making progress, it's still not an excuse for inaction, for giving up. Remember that knowing when and how to fight requires wisdom. That is, that just having a zeal for truth should be tempered by wisdom. You've heard it said, just because something's true doesn't mean you should say it, and sometimes that's definitely the case. I think maybe in a overreaction perhaps, to what we would call political correctness, maybe sometimes we say, well, it doesn't matter what they think, or it doesn't matter how I say it, all that matters is what I say is true. Well, that might not always be the case. There might be a wise time and place and way in which to say the truth without watering it down. Even the timing, in addition to how you say it, is important. And remember, last of all, from our passage, as we looked at it and sought to draw some things from it, that my brother's battle is my battle too. That we know so many people, and perhaps we ourselves are also fighting difficult battles in our own lives, and that even the smallest thing, the smallest act of kindness can help in the battle, as well as devoting our lives to helping other people to deal with the things that have been thrown at them. I just encourage you to look at all of that, maybe do some more reading in a book like Deuteronomy that we don't usually devote as much time and attention to, and look for what God has to teach us there. And in all of this discussion of fulfilling a covenant that we enter into, it's definitely appropriate to give an opportunity now for anyone who wants to enter into the covenant of Jesus' blood through baptism, to reenact His death, burial, and resurrection, to start out on a journey that will include many battles, and to trust in God to bring us to an ultimate victory, so that ultimately we can go into the promised land, which for us will be heaven. And so if we can help you in any way, if you'd like to confess sin or be baptized or ask for something, you can come as we stand and sing.